So here's where we left off in part one. So here's part two of your death and dying lecture. And this is, I think, maybe the most relevant for college age students. How do we relate to the person who has died? And then we'll finish up with how do you relate to someone who is grieving? So, first of all, when someone has died, um, originally, psychologists thought that it was important to detach from the deceased person. So we want to just, pick ourselves up and move forward and go on. Okay. Um, but that turned out to not maybe be so helpful because if any of you have experienced the death of someone close to you, you know that that person isn't really, gone from your thoughts or gone from your heart. They may be gone from your house or they may be gone from, the activities that you would do together. But the influence that that person had in your life is still very much a part of your world, and it's still informing the choices that you're making today. So today, psychologists encourage what's called continuing bonds or maintaining a relationship with the deceased person. Now, this does not mean a la Psycho, where you have your dead mother, in a rocking chair in the front of your house, right? That's not what this is. But this is about not, trying to pretend like that person, because they're no longer in physical form, um, has no more bearing on your life. Okay. So each person is certainly different, like I've said many times, and each relationship is different. So, like, for example, when my father died, I was 19, my sister was 15. We have the same father, but because each of us is different, we had a different relationship with him. So our grieving process was actually for a different person, even though it was the same person, because the way that we related to that individual was different. Um, um, the death of a child, as you might expect, is particularly overwhelming and one of the most difficult things that a human being can endure. My very, very first client that I had when I started practicing was a couple whose son had committed suicide. And I had absolutely no idea what to do. Unfortunately, I was still in my supervised internship period, so I was able to ask and get some help. But if you ever, that feeling of, wow, I can't change this for you. What is it that I can do that would be helpful? Was really sort of gut punching, and it really showed me um, how important listening is and how important not trying to, like stick my fingers in and fix anything because I can't fix it. What a therapist, a grief counselor can help you with is the way that you are adjusting to that transition. And that's a real important distinction. Likewise, when a child experiences the death of a parent, there's some correlating evidence that suggests that that child is at greater risk for developing psychological problems. The parent, and of course children are profoundly biologically aware of this, the parent provides their needs. The parent gives them food, gives them shelter, gives them, water, gives them security, these things. And the death of that figure in their lives could literally be the end of their life, depending on how young they are. Your mother dies when you're 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old, 4 weeks old. You have to find an alternate source, for nutrition. You have to find an alternate source, so hopefully there are other adults in your life who can do that for you. But children are dead on 100%, aware of how much that parent matters to them, especially about 0 to 5, 0 to 6 years old. So complicated grief is a term that applies to grief that includes anger, bitterness, resentment over someone's death, as well as sort of this yearning to reconnect with the deceased that goes, sort of beyond um, uh, the natural yearning for someone who is gone. Complicated grief is a diagnosis, so it is a pathology. Grief can be a disease when it reaches this stage, complicated grief or pathological grief. Um, but grief in and of itself is not a disease. Grief is the normal and natural response to a transition and a change of any kind. Okay, grief is a normal and natural response to a transition or change of any kind. But, people who are unable to re-engage in their lives, um, so perhaps the death was particularly traumatic or sudden losses. So like I said in part one, sudden losses are, sudden cardiac arrests, accidents, homicide, suicide. There's often a much longer period for the survivors to even begin to adjust to the new reality of their lives. So continuing bonds, this is part of the stage of bereavement. So remember, bereavement is that noun, that house that people go into when they're grieving, that allows you to maintain some sort of ongoing relationship with that deceased. And this is going to, of course, look different for every individual, depending on the relationship that you had when that individual was alive, depending on whether or not you belong to a faith-based community. All of the things that make you who you are going to influence how this works. And then grief work, okay, is exactly what it sounds like. It's an active stance aimed with coping with the loss that you've experienced. So it's a psychological process of coping with that loss where we want to move ourselves forward into a new reality where we shift the type of relationship that we had with that deceased individual. So it is not like sit around and just wait for enough time to pass and things will be different. Well, things are always different after time passes, but that doesn't mean you've done any grief work. Grief work is actively looking at what that death has triggered for you, how you're reacting to it, how you're responding to it, and what you can do to continue to move through this stage in a healthy way. So there are all sorts of coping myths out there in our culture about what you should do when someone dies. And the key word here, as you might look at in this slide, is myth. So myth number one, distress or depression is inevitable when we experience a loss of some sort. Some people experience distress and depression, other people do not. Myth number two, experiencing distress after a loss is necessary, and failure to experience distress is indicative of pathology. Absolutely not. Absolutely not true. Myth number three, it is important to work through, to process, in order to recover successfully from the loss. This is also not true. Grief work can certainly be very helpful, but it's not a requirement for having a healthy response to the death of a loved one. Myth number four, a person who experiences a loss will go through a phase of intense distress, but this will not last indefinitely. Also not true. And then myth number five, as a result of working through a loss, people will achieve a state of resolution. Not true either. Some people do achieve some sort of meaning, some way of sort of closure, such a nasty word in the field, but some sort of acceptance of the new reality. But many people don't. So you want to always be aware of anything that is absolute, and what will often happen in families, because when an individual in a family dies, that family dynamic and the family patterns and the family systems are challenged. So every person in the family has to reevaluate their role in the family, and so things from the past can begin informing decisions made in the present. All kinds of chaos and fracturing can occur within a family unit when there's a death within the family. And one thing that can happen is that people will start to look at other family members and kind of judge the way they're grieving. Like, oh, he's not grieving right, or she just won't get over it, or, and as you might expect, these sorts of judgments are not terribly helpful for anyone involved. There are, a billion ways to process our grief, and one way is not better than another. What we want to make sure that we're always doing is acknowledging feelings in some way. So rituals, most cultures and most religions have some kind of ritual for working through grief. These rituals can be designed to create some sort of meaning around the death. They are designed to help the griever actually physically move through a transformative process. So it's like a wedding where you move from being, one person to then going through the wedding, and then you are part of a couple. You're starting a different kind of life. You were a ritual, a funeral, all different. There's so many different types of death rituals and funerals. These are for the survivors also to help them really have a place where all they have to do is be grieving. All they have to do is be in mourning. They don't have to go to work, take care of anything else, and that place can mark, the transition, a world in which the deceased was there to a world in which the deceased is no longer with us on this planet. And these can provide a lot of comfort, but they're of course not going to fix anything. But that transition is one way of societally recognizing that there are now different roles at play. They can offer a sense of connection to who and what was lost while still allowing the bereaved to maintain that all-important connection with the deceased. But there's all different kinds of ways that cultures and religions do it, but the vast majority of cultures and religions have some sort of death ritual that helps people with this transition. Societal mourning is when a whole group of people, a large population, comes together in order to make sense of a major loss or other traumatic event. So probably before all of you were born, JFK's assassination was an example of societal mourning, the aftermath of that. Princess Diana's death, there was societal mourning around that. 9/11, same thing. If you've been in Prescott for a while, when the 19 hotshots died, Prescott went through its own societal mourning around the loss of those individuals. So it's even if we don't know the people directly, they were part of a community. So a president or when Robin Williams died a few years ago, fans they went and they put, cards, flowers, teddy bears, all sorts of stuff around his house. Kind of pick your thing. If there is if there's an individual that was impactful to a large group of people, or like with the hotshots, it was a large group of people who died that was associated with a single community. People will come together to share in the mourning because we all feel a part of that relationship, even if we didn't personally know the deceased. So some common things that occur with bereavement is people will start to have an appreciation for life and the world around them in a different way. They'll start to see things differently, especially after they go through the death of someone they love for the first time. The first time is a big transition period. People will try to find some meaning. Sometimes people will reevaluate their own lives. They'll try to find some meaning in the death of their loved one. The ways that the bereaved are maintaining relationships or representations of the deceased change. Some people will put up all kinds of pictures. Some people will take pictures down. Some people will try to preserve a room for a period of time. And that's okay for a little bit of time, but if that starts to go on for years and years where no one can kind of go in that room, we see this a lot with the death of children. Parents will preserve that room just as it was the last time their child was in it. And that's ultimately hindering their grieving process. And then number 4, we want to pay attention to how that individual is learning to control their emotions or regulate them and experience all of the complicated feelings that come along with grieving. So J. William Worden came up with these 4 tasks, and these are sort of the evolution of Kubler-Ross's stages. Okay, so here these are specifically for the griever. And here, step number 1, to accept the reality of the loss. So first and foremost, we have to understand and really get it in our bodies that that individual has died. So it's one thing to intellectually understand it. It's a whole other thing to really physically get it. And like I mentioned earlier, when the loss has been sudden, there's sometimes a very delayed reaction response to being able to accept this reality. Next step to work through to the pain of grief. So this is about helping individuals feel. However those feelings manifest, however complex and contradictory those feelings are, we want to help people actually experience those feelings so that they can move forward. Next, to adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing. Okay, so this is adjusting, adapting. How do we bring forward what is relevant about our relationship with the deceased into a world in which we're able to continue actively living, which feeds into the next stage, to emotionally relocate the deceased and move into the next stage of your life. And there is no time period on this, depending on the loss. A spouse dies, you'll see people jump back into relationships 2 or 3 months after a spouse dies. Some people will never jump back into or will never get back into a relationship. So again, very individual process. Any type of transition can utilize these 4 tasks to help you adjust and find better framework for your life. So it's, we tend to think of transitions and changes being negative, but you can make changes that are very positive that still have a grief response attached to them because you are having to leave behind something that's familiar in order to move into something new. So even something that is generally as celebratory as high school graduation and moving on to college, there's a loss to the self that you were when you were in high school and the group of friends that you had when you were in high school, and how you're all going to end up at very different places doing very different things, most likely. And basically, everyone knows after high school graduation that it's not ever going to be the same. Even if we're excited about our future, there's the loss of what came before. And so that's an opportunity to grieve, not to, lock yourself in your room and never come out, but a chance to just acknowledge the gifts of your childhood and your early adolescence, and to honor what you were taught, what you learned, what mistakes you made, and then examine what you want to move forward into the next phase of your life with. That's just essentially these tasks applied to something like that, something like high school graduation. So we don't get over a death. We don't get over a loss. We adjust and we adapt. Okay? And that adaptation can look any number of ways. But they're not gonna be that moment where we wake up and we're like, oh, I'm done. I'm over it. Woohoo! But there will come a time when we know that we have made a new way forward. So your reading also talks about Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl was a prisoner in a Nazi death camp. He watched his wife, his parents, and his brothers being killed. And he went on to become an existential psychologist. And his a book that you might have read if you've taken philosophy, Man's Search for Meaning is one of his most famous books. And he suggested that we form three different kinds of meanings in our lives, or that there are three forms of meaning. And you might imagine surviving a Nazi death camp really would make you question the meaning of anything, and why some people lived, why some people died, why that was allowed to happen, why, all of these sorts of things. And so very powerful survivor stories from the Nazi death camps. And so these three things: the meaning of life, so what it is we're doing now, okay, so what gives our current life relevance; the will to meaning, so that's our inner pull, our private desire to find some meaning, to find some order in the chaos of this world. And then the freedom to will. Okay, so this is our desire to rise above our circumstances. So like with him, he's in the death camp. This freedom to will allowed him to spiritually, psychologically, whatever term you want to use, survive the conditions that he found himself in. So these three forms of meaning he felt exist in the world, and the way that an individual utilizes these three meanings and relates to them can impact their coping and adaptation strategies. So our existentialist Viktor Frankl thought that we all face these three things that he called the tragic triad. We all are going to have to deal with the question of death. We're all going to wrestle with guilt, and we're all going to experience suffering. And so he felt that searching for meaning is more important than finding the meaning. The search for meaning allows an individual to get beyond their own self and into the larger world, which is healthy. If we're only kind of, myopically looking at ourselves and not looking at how we relate to the rest of the world, we could miss a lot of things that would be helpful in our development. So searching for that meaning to help us understand about a particular circumstance in our lives. Finding meaning, and there's no answer, right? Like this is the meaning of life, this is the meaning of death, this is the meaning of this, right? We're all going to try to wrestle with this question in our own way. So that word subjectively is really important. So finding meaning refers to, one, subjectively making sense of a given event, and then in doing so, number two, finding some positive consequences to the event. What are some things that you can take forward? So if you remember, like I said in the very beginning of part one, there were certainly some positive consequences to my dad's early death. And one of the biggest ones was the direction that my career took me and my own writing took me. So not everybody wants to find meaning, and not everybody seems to have a need to find meaning. So you may have a need to make sense and find meaning of things, but your sibling might not. Okay. And in many cases, it's not actually possible to find that meaning because it would be a subjective conclusion. There doesn't seem to be any, giant answer key, where we're all like able to punch in our coordinates and figure out why we're here, where we are and why we are in this particular time and place. Even people who report that they have found meaning after a particular loss often continue sort of searching for a deeper meaning or a deeper purpose. So, like I said, you can experience grief even when there's not been a death. Okay, so that was the high school kind of graduation example that I just gave you. It's normal and natural to experience grief many, many different times in your life, varying intensities. Moving away to start a new job is it may not have the same intensity as the death of a child, but that does not mean that the experience and the emotions are not as real and as 100%. Okay. So if you find yourself with a friend or a family member who has lost someone has died in their life, it's hard to know what to say and it's hard to know what to do. And I think it's super important to know that there is nothing that you can say that will actually change anything for that person. So like, whew, you can like step back, let yourself off the hook on that. You don't have to fix it. Okay. So lots of things, and I'm sure that you can add to this list if you've ever experienced the death of someone. Things people will say that are generally very well-meaning, but come across as insensitive at best and sometimes downright cruel. Things like boys don't cry, keep a stiff upper lip, keep your chin up. I know just how you feel. This is a really, really unhelpful statement. The best we can do is maybe have some sense of how we feel, but just because my father died when I was 19 and your father died when you were 19 doesn't mean I have any idea how you feel. It just means we have a shared experience. It's been, fill in the blank, week, month, year. Aren't you over it yet? Don't be a baby. Stop whining. Be quiet. These are things people will say sometimes to children. Think of all the children starving in Africa. So this is something that was said a lot when I was growing up, and I don't hear it as much today. But what that's doing is that's deflecting your experience of grieving, and it's trying to get you to rank it against other people who may have maybe worse off than you. And whereas it may be true that starvation is not something that you would wish on anyone, minimizing your own experience doesn't allow you to fully experience your own feelings. He or she is in a better place. Whatever your version is of a higher power has a plan. Terribly unhelpful. Those two are terribly unhelpful things to say. This is something, and you're probably going to be horrified, but when people experience a miscarriage or a stillbirth, people will say things like, at least you can have another child, or at least you already have, 2 other children or 3 other children. And they're sort of, if you've ever been around someone who's experienced a death, maybe you felt all tongue-tied and you weren't really sure what to do because it is a very uncomfortable time. You don't want to make things worse. And, people will stumble. Their speech will stumble. They won't say helpful things. And so, but that, hopefully you can see how that is very much an unhelpful thing to say. When a spouse dies, at least you had someone to love you for a while. Not terribly helpful. Again, hear this for children. I'll give you something to cry about. You're so moody all the time. There's just a myriad of things that people will say. Most of the time in an attempt to be helpful, in an attempt to say something, in an attempt to, diffuse some of the intense emotion. But hear me on this. You can't fix it, and you can't say anything to change it. So what can you do? Well, what you can do is you can remain present in that griever's life. So people will say, call me if you need anything, and then they'll slip out the back door. But you be the one who calls instead and just say, hey, you want to go catch a movie? You want to go out for coffee? You want to, treat them like regular people, right? Don't put some sort of, untouchable status on them. Help them, be and re-engage with the world at large and be there to listen. But every time you see them, you don't have to pick at it and say, so how are you doing? How are you feeling? Blah, blah, blah. They'll tell you if they trust you, and they'll tell you if they feel a need to. But creating some normalcy, being the friend who does not go away, speaks volumes. And they know, and if you've ever been grieving, you know that there's nothing anyone can say to change anything. And you also know about the intense vacuum that occurs after the funeral when everyone else goes back to their own lives, and then no one knows what to say to you. And so as a result, no one says anything to you. And then more and more time passes, and the griever feels more and more socially isolated. So be the friend that hangs in there. Be the one who calls just to say, hey. Be the one who, takes them out for happy hour. Be the one who, brings a pizza over, or, whatever. After the funeral, after the couple weeks where there's so many things going on that the griever has no space. It's in the months after that person really could use a friend and really will know who his or her real friends are by who's there in that period. Some things to be careful of is to be careful of shutting down people's grieving processes. And one way, again, that we very inadvertently do this is by offering Kleenex. Offering Kleenex or going up to and sort of aggressively hugging people. It seems like you're being helpful to hand someone a tissue, but the underlying message of that is to please stop crying, like there's snot running down your face and there's all these tears and you're making these sounds and I don't know what to do with that. So here, let people cry, let them be all snotty and kind of messy, and it'll stop when it stops. That's a natural physical response to grief, and we want to allow that to move. Okay. So again, here, just to recap, we want to fix things, but we can't fix this. And death isn't about something broken. It's not like your transmission broke. So since we can't change the death, what we can do is be present with the grievers. We can reach out. We cannot run away. And we can allow there to be silence. Okay, just to let there be just two people sitting, on a bench in the square, just hanging out. That is not only okay, but incredibly helpful. And so if you or someone who is mourning, beware of something called short-term energy relieving behaviors, or STIRBs. These are activities that perhaps in small doses are not necessarily bad, but when they're used in such a way as to continue to fill time and not allow emotions to process, they can turn toxic and very unhealthy. So like, for example, exercise, certainly not an unhealthy behavior in and of itself, but if someone is compulsively exercising, 6, 7, 8 hours a day, they're always at the gym, they're always, when they're not there, they're running and they're out, you might want to take a look at that, because that behavior may likely be a deflection for deeper feelings, for the expression of deeper feelings. Excessive busyness. We are a culture that honors and recognizes being busy as being successful. So the more busy you are, the harder you are to reach, the more successful you might appear. But often a griever will use this busyness, will fill every single slot in their calendar, so that they go home at the end of the day finally exhausted, and they just fall into bed, and there's not any space to process the loss. Drug and alcohol abuse, very, very common way of self-medicating. Shopping, okay, so consumption, buying 82 pairs of socks, t-shirts, shoes, especially when this reaches where an individual is spending beyond their income level, beyond their means to pay for the items. This is something to watch. Food. Okay, so of course we all have to eat, but sometimes people will turn to food as a way to exact control. So people may overeat or undereat as a response to grief. So just some things to look at. And finally, writing. There's a lot of evidence about writing as an effective therapeutic tool. James Pennebaker created these guidelines in a very early book in the 80s about writing and healing. And he says that trauma in writing can be confronted in a very healthy way when we write 20 minutes a day over a period of about 4 days. Write in a place where you're safe and you feel comfortable. Write about issues that you're currently living with, or trauma that you've never, discussed or disclosed. Write about happy things too. But it's important, and this is the most important part, is to not only write about what happened, but write about the feelings that you're experiencing about what happened. That's the link, those events with feelings that seem to create the most benefit when using writing in a therapeutic context. The more detailed you are in your description of an event, the more helpful it's going to be. You don't have to show this to anyone. You don't have to even keep it. But again, the key is to link the feelings with the events. So you're not just listing what happened, you're exploring how what happened made you feel. But make sure that writing is not all that you do. Don't spend too much time in your head intellectualizing things that happened. Don't use writing as a way of complaining or venting. That's not going to move you forward. That's going to just kind of keep you stuck. And be careful of becoming overly self-absorbed, which is counterproductive. So just give you a minute to take a look at these. Examining pain through writing. Something happens. We receive a shock or a blow. We explore it, put it into words. The act of putting things into words stops us from seeing the event as random. And so we start to understand the order of things. Even if we can't find a cosmic order or anything like that, we are able to see the causal chain of events. So even in a car accident, that resulted in a fatality, if we can see, well, this was what happened. This person turned left, or this person ran the red light, or the deceased, was drinking, or whatever it was. It helps us see things in some sort of order. When we express things in language, when we take things out of our own minds and put them on paper, it helps to soften the experience. It doesn't mean it minimizes the experience, but when something is outside of us, at last, it doesn't have so much power to control everything that we do. We're linking order and chaos. Okay, so in our first set, we were linking feelings with the events. This is another way that writing can be helpful, creating order from chaos. Expressing ourselves in really any art form helps us establish a connection with other people and with the world around us. So this helps us step outside of ourselves and move forward. And then the narrative process can also help us examine insights that we received from those painful experiences and start to see, like, if we are searching for meaning or if we are searching for the positive effects, writing is a way that can be beneficial to do that. And so finally, Viktor Frankl says, having been is still a form of being. Okay, so this is a great play on the verbs. A person who once lived lives. And every person that person touched, every choice that person made that impacted the world and impacted others, is still having repercussions. Okay, so make your life choices such that when death comes, you look back and you say, I did the best I could with what I had, and I impacted others in a positive way, and I found a way in this crazy life to have some joy.